You know, we welcome the Chief Medical Officer of Vitality Health Matrix, Sarah Gibson, who's joining us for the first time. And we're always welcome to have Dr. Bryan Donohue. You know, Hurricane Milton has just thrown this country in further chaos, particularly when you think about Hurricane Helene. Milton's deadly onslaught this week in Florida alone has left over 3 million people without power after destructive 100-mile-per-hour winds. It's just amazing what this storm, the havoc, is wreaking on our country. When you think about the devastation in Gaza by missiles and bombs, and you look at the devastation by natural disasters, the storms, the chaos, there's no comparison. I mean, parts of Florida and North Carolina looks like it looked maybe 200 years ago. You know, I was thinking, Sarah and Dr. Donohue, you know, the one thing that we have to do, we don't do enough of, is that you just got to offer up a prayer for those families. You know, I remember the great English preacher, Charles Spurgeon, who once wrote that I've learned to kiss the wave that throws against the rock of ages. You know, what a powerful reminder of two seminal lessons that we're experiencing in this life right now with these storms. And it reminds us that there is a creator, the rock of all the ages, who stands the test of time and humanity, who has seen all this before. And despite all this, who still loves and cares for his people. And yet, all of us are called in this fallen world of sin to take up our cross daily, identify with the suffering of those in North Carolina and Florida and around the world and in Gaza. And yet we recognize waves of hardship will always follow us all the days of our lives. That's part of the human struggle. And then we trust in something greater than ourselves. And we can not only endure when we trust in something greater than ourselves, but we also find a way to thrive with an inner peace and joy. There's more to life than what we see. There's something great out there, Sarah. And so as you think about these storms and this turbulence, I ask you to offer your commentary on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is we don't understand the why behind why things happen, why they impact certain areas, why they impact certain people. But we were never promised an easy life, right? And I think, exactly to your point, the only thing that we can do when we're not in those situations is to offer our support, offer our prayers, and also remember to be thankful and grateful for the things that we do have, because we know that there are going to be times in our lives where we're also going to go through very difficult times, and we're going to have to rely on each other as well for that support.
Dr. Donohue?
I love your opening comments. Thanks for including me today. It's interesting, though, isn't it, to think that whispering a prayer as this behemoth of the storm relentlessly approaches your coast, your home, your way of life, could have any effect at all. There's an old adage in the Christian lore, which is to say that the ground before the cross is level. And so there's all different ways for us to approach the crown. And one, which you highlight, but I want to just unpack a little bit, is courage. So the courage to believe that we could whisper into the night some little iteration in the face of these huge forces of nature, and that might have some effect, but yet we know that's true. You know, it's not the first punch in the bar fight that puts you down, but the second one might. And so it is with these kind of twin storms, the devastation, the time to recovery, the pain that people have once this is way out of the news cycle can't be estimated. And it is the case, as you suggest, that we do go beyond our skin. And in a very real way, their suffering is likewise our suffering. So what could be more timely than that private midnight prayer?
Sarah, Walk us through, if we find ourselves in those situations, and we do because our brothers are in them, what do we do to bring relief? How do we make a difference in the lives of those where they're struggling? Do we do it through the Red Cross? Do we do it through Western Union? Do we get in our pickup trucks, and if we have the special skill that we drive there, making us believe that we can make a difference? In times like these, what is it that people really need on the simple things that we often forget, where we can really make a difference in places like Florida and North Carolina and the places that are affected by these storms? Sarah?
And I think that there's a simple answer to that, or an answer that impacts every person the same way, right? So to a single mom with 4 children, the relief that she may need is safe harbor and shelter and providing for her family, right? To the elderly gentleman who has been replaced and has nothing but his dog, having someone that's going to take him in, because a lot of the shelters don't allow for animals to come in as safe harbor, right? So I think asking the questions, filling that gap based on what people are asking help with. I don't know if it's monetary. For some people, it can be monetary. For other people, it could be going down and offering medical services, relief to clearing debris, right? I think just meeting people where they are and being open to listening and knowing that there are different needs for different people in different situations.
You know, Dr. Donohue, we've heard the stories that people in certain neighborhoods are beginning to smell the stench of death, disease. They're beginning to see certain animals that only come out and certain bugs that only come out in an environment like this. What are the other things that are growing that's just as deadly as what these storms bring forth from the earth?
Well, Armstrong, these experiences are so far removed from the day-to-day moments that me and you and Sarah and our viewers experience. It's a little like people who spend time in combat, who come back with a kind of inner experience that none of us can really embrace or understand. The first thing to say here is that this is trauma, and trauma is a kind of discrete biological event. And it's very much more difficult to recover from trauma than, say, for example, not having shelter or not having the impact of this in terms of our day-to-day lives way after this event is really hard to measure and probably the most enduring aspect of all of this. But you're right. The scent, the people say that smell is the most primordial of all the senses. People say that as we evolved in a warm swamp all those millennia ago, that the single scent that we had as single-celled organisms was smell. So there is the smell of death. You see it. You see it routinely in large city emergency rooms, and you see it in combat, and you see it here. The smell of decay, the sense of hopelessness, of being forlorn, of no longer having agency in your life. And I think that we're in it in this case here for the long, long haul. A wise man in India was once asked, what does it mean to be enlightened? And his answer was to know the needs of the times. So as Sarah suggested, the needs of the times vary from person to person, from locale to locale. I spoke with a physician, a friend of mine who's in North Carolina. He's a world-renowned heart surgeon, and he said that it's stunning. It's staggering. There aren't words to describe it in his own life. So he's a heart surgeon there in the western aspect of North Carolina. The hospital has no water. There's no IV fluids. When people come in shock, you can't respond in the normal way. The production of needed, really rudimentary medical necessities for a hospital setting just aren't available. So you're quite right. It is like Gaza. It is like Fallujah or Vietnam in the old days. And I think it's hard for a lot of us to kind of put our arms around it. But the scope of this is enormous and will endure for months to years.
Sarah, Dr. Donohue just reminded me of something that I had not even considered. When you think about the airborne pathogens, indoor flooding of homes and buildings also causes the growth of mold. We've seen it in our own homes, and sometimes we can smell it. Fungi deteriorate the indoor air quality and affect occupational health long after a storm, and it just continues to grow. Even small leaks can lead to the growth of mold in ventilation and air conditioning systems, which deteriorates the air quality, compromising respiration, and even aggravating your own immune responses of those who inhale those spores. Just something deadly in the air that we don't even think about.
Yeah, I think Dr. Donohue highlights well, because there's the immediate wave, right, of the trauma, of tragedy, of this terrible event, right? And then there's this scary wave of people recovering and putting their lives and homes back together. But then there are continued waves and ripples that just go on and on for months, years afterwards, that we can't even predict and that we aren't even aware of today. And so I think the most difficult thing is when you provide relief just for that moment in time and then withdraw any type of support, you're not helping long term, right? Even just providing the education that potentially mold could be growing later on, right? Like that there are pathogens out there that impact us secretly in a way that we don't recognize, and they can lead to vague symptoms then that we're seeking medical advice or we're seeking care and relief from. And it takes some time to dissect it and track that back to the original event.
As we go to break, people talk about in these storms the increase in joint pain, headaches, and painful flare-up or older injuries that people have had. Just want to bring perspective and scale of what people in our country are suffering and what they're going through. And at the very least, we can just keep them in our thoughts and our daily prayers. And we'll be back. And welcome back to the broadcast. We're so honored to have Sarah Gibson and Dr. Donohue join us today. I tell you this, once a farmer, always a farmer. Oftentimes when I wake up in the morning, sometimes I just don't want to have a breakfast. I want to do it quickly. I want to think about cereal and other things that make it simple. But, it brings me to this, because sometimes people are uncomfortable having this conversation, Dr. Donohue, about processed foods that are often altered, whether it's canning, freeze packaging, and adding ingredients. And when you think about things like breakfast cereals and processed meat, these sweetened beverages that people love, bread, candy, dairy products, all these things, Sarah and Dr. Donohue, have been altered. Now, when we were on the farm and growing this fresh meat and eggs and all this produce, none of this was altered. But so much has changed since America is no longer a farming nation, but has become more of a consumption nation. Dr. Donohue, talk about the dangers of these processed foods?
Well, so, you know, Armstrong, this is a topic which in the public discourse is just now starting to really bubble up in earnest. Right. In days of yore, when it was farm to table, life was simple, not quite so simple now. And we've seen one of the most disturbing things is this occurrence, this increased prevalence of malignancy, particularly among young people. And we have to be very careful and very measured in thinking about this, not so much as consumers, but as clinical scientists. So if you think how long it took us to identify causality between smoking cigarettes and that abnormal finding on your chest film, it took a long, long time. Likewise with processed foods. But there are things that we can say and say with confidence. The first thing is that the new understanding of what the molecular biology of age is highlights one thing, Strong, and that is the transcendent negative impact of sugar and sugar substitutes. So it's turned out that at my old alma mater at UCL, there's a very persuasive model of aging that has to do with the extent to which DNA is altered. DNA is altered as a consequence of increased insulin. And so eating foods that provoke insulin provocation is a bad thing. Lots and lots of processed foods fall into that category. So just to state the obvious and the most egregious offenders, begin with processed meat. So processed meat is like death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, it's just, there's nothing good about it. I won't bore you with the metabolic pathway, but within 2 or 3 metabolic iterations, it is present as nitrosamines, which are wickedly malignant products. So your beef jerky and processed ham and so forth, if the viewers of this show just did one thing to advance their own well-being, it would be not to eat pigs. Remember, it's an old adage from the ancient texts in Leviticus, and not eating pigs. So, and particularly processed pigs. That's also the case for processed meats. And with this new data rising up about insulin activity, sugar and sugar substitutes. So even as you say, now that we live 5 standard deviations away from the field, we can still make wise choices. And in fact, I would argue, because we're further away, we have a broader array of food. There's no single diet, Armstrong, that is the right diet for the entire of your viewership. But there are tar pits that we should avoid. We should avoid, like I said, sugar and sugar substitutes. We should avoid processed meats, and that's particularly processed ham and beef jerky and that kind of thing.
Beef jerky?
I know that one hurts.
No, I don't do it. But I'm interested because the beef jerky sells everywhere, and people don't even think about. It's
yes,
terrible.
Armstrong, and it's impulse buying. And there's not a viewer among us who can say, "Oh, I've never had beef jerky." Sometimes you walk in the store, you're a little hungry. That's the impulse I'm actually asking that we particularly avoid. One of the broad aphorisms that comes up is we should eat deliberately. So in the same way that we choose our words carefully, likewise, we should eat carefully. And those impulse things are probably things for us to avoid. But yeah, so beef jerky, and in general, while it's true that there's not a single diet to rightly care for all of us, there are things we can say. So, for example, pigmented vegetables are just simply like water in the canteen. However we got thirsty, that cool water. So the goodness, it's almost as if God built those bright colors, the redness of the beet and the deep green of the broccoli to be attractive to your eyes. In fact, those products are called riboflavins. They're like color, they're like flavors for the eye. So steamed vegetables, steamed brown rice. If you take animal protein, cold water ocean fish, that means cod, halibut, salmon, flounder, mackerel, bass, grouper. In general, Armstrong, staying away from meat, and for heaven's sakes, all processed meat. Not eating at night is a fundamental thing. Eating when the sun is high in the sky, ideally 50 to 70% of the calories would come between noon and 2. And so these are some of the particular details. Remember, Paul said in 2 Corinthians, one doesn't own, but one stewards the body. So we're trying now to make available to people the details of what that stewardship might look like for them.
Sarah, let's talk about, cancer, that C word. What specific types of cancer are linked to the consumption of processed foods, and how do preservatives and additives in processed foods contribute to cancer risk? And what is it, like Dr. Donohue just mentioned, beef jerky, these things that we eat moving fast, what can people do to be wise in their choices, what they consume in their bodies?
I think the difficult thing is that there is so much information out there that you just don't know who to listen to, right? And so as people who love science and medicine, we rely on data and research, okay? And so the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, and the U.S. National Toxicology Program have classified carcinogens, right? Things that we come into contact with our body, but things that we put into our body, different foods, different drinks, into different categories based on the evidence that is out there, okay? And specifically their cancer causing potential in humans, okay? So anything that's classified as group 1 is shown to cause cancer in humans, okay? There is strong evidence from human studies that it causes cancer. So just as Dr. Donohue was saying, processed meats, nitrates is one of those examples. And so if you only eat 2 pieces of bacon a day, every day, you are increasing your risk of colorectal cancer by 18%, okay? That also translates to just 1 sausage link a day, okay? So there is good information out there. So group 1 carcinogens. The next category is group 2, and it can be divided into 2A and 2B. So 2A is it's probably carcinogenic to humans. There's strong evidence in animal research, limited evidence in human research, but it seems like that's following along the same path, right? So that would be more your red meat. So some beef, pork, lamb, and it has increased risk and evidence for colorectal, pancreatic, prostate cancers. Also things that are found in starchy processed foods like fries, chips, and bread. So when these things are cooked at high temperatures, like frying or baking, they can increase the acrylamide, which is carcinogenic compounds, right? So those are some of the things that you want to be on the search for. And then group 2B, or like limited evidence. I think these things are bad. There's not a ton of research, but like lead falls in. Like you don't really want to be exposing yourself to lead, okay? That's contaminated in old piping or during the food processing. And then groups 3 and 4, there's just not a lot of evidence. So, when I approach this with my patients, I think that education and knowing where to look for answers is really, really important. But there are preservatives in food. There are different types of food. There are ways that we cook food that significantly increase cancer risk in multiple different cancers within the body.
What about the drinks?
So if you look at the classification, so group 2B, probably carcinogenic. If we're looking at saccharin, just as Dr. Donohue mentioned, so artificial sweeteners, saccharin has been in the past linked to bladder cancer and increasing some of those risks. They don't have great human research on it right now, but I think the more important thing is drinks like that contain artificial sweeteners, sodas, those types of things, will exactly what Dr. Donohue said, they will mess with insulin levels, and they are hormone disruptors. And they will mess with things like satiety and leptin, like when you're hungry, your body produces ghrelin, which is the grrr, my stomach is growling, right? And leptin gives your body the counterbalance and says, hey, I'm full, don't eat anything else. So when you're eating processed foods, when you're drinking these chemicals, it will mess with the leptin and ghrelin biofeedback system, and it causes you to overeat and crave foods that are not good for you, which then can lead to obesity and insulin disruption and increased inflammation with your body, then continues down the road to the pathway of causing different types of cancer.
Quickly, before we go to break, what can we eat in terms of the meats? and the other processed foods, and what can we drink other than water?
Other than water, you took the sharpest arrow out of the quiver. So meat should be not more than once, maybe twice
What
a week.
meat? What meat, Dr. Donahue?
So
Specific.
if you're going to take red meat, I'm not advocating it, but
I'm
if
not
you're
asking you to
taking red
advocate.
meat,
I'm just asking you to tell us what's safe. Totally
what's safe
minimizes it.
is meat exposure once or twice a week. That's grass-fed with no pesticides, no antibiotics. You can get that simply by asking. I love the cold water ocean fish. There's very persuasive basic science data that dementia in America is largely the consequence of a chronically fish-impoverished diet. So bear that in mind. Ask yourself, how did the master feed the hillside crowd of 5,000? It wasn't with sausage. So red meat once a week, maybe twice a week. Cold water ocean fish. I love plant-based products, Armstrong, which we'll talk about down the road.
Well, let me ask you, do you ever get to a point where you reach a certain age where none of this matters anymore?
No, you don't. So to say that it no longer matters when you're 80, go ahead, light up a smoke and have a bourbon. No, you continue to be the same transcendent identity when you're 80 as you were when you were 16. So we honor the body. And we honor the body by basically supporting the body in these fashions. One of the interesting points that Sarah made just a second ago about...
Before you get to the interesting point that Sarah made, when we return, there's a favorite drink of people that we're going to really focus on that causes cancer, and you're going to be stunned at the latest. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence, there's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. Don't get upset with the messenger. Just listen to the message, okay? The weekend is upon us, right? I know the Commanders are playing the Ravens tomorrow. God's willing, I'm going to be right there. But are you planning to visit a bar and enjoy drinks while you're at the game, or sitting at home getting buzzed because your team is playing? And sometimes you drink because you feel good, and sometimes you drink more because you feel bad. Well, I'm going to give you something to consider, okay? There was a recent report for the American Association for Cancer Research, a prominent, I must say, not-for-profit cancer research center, found that 5.4% of all cancers in 2019 were linked to excessive alcohol consumption. Now, alcohol abuse is not anything that's new. Consider Genesis 9:18. You know, I love the Bible, right? I love to go there. And Noah after the flood. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And guess what? And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Despite its pervasiveness, only in the past 2 decades have studies emerged highlighting the alarming risk of alcohol consumption. Let me tell you, alcohol weakens inhibitions, encouraging primal, reprehensible behavior, and our bodies and minds become uncontrollable. Memory is lost, yet alcohol use remains ubiquitous. Why is that, Sarah Ferguson? Why is it no one talks about that elephant in the room, alcohol? It is just as dangerous as marijuana and all these other drugs.
Mm-hmm. It is, but we're living, I believe, in the most stressed out time in society, right? And people are looking to take a break and release themselves from that stress and that constant pressure. And alcohol is an easier way than trying to do meditation techniques, right? It is something that also is a social norm. So, you know, if I go out somewhere and someone says, "Hey, you want to smoke?" and I say, "No, I'm good. I don't smoke." That's fine. People don't care. But if you say, "Oh no, I'm just gonna have club soda. I'm not gonna have alcohol," I mean, all eyes are on you, right? Like, why aren't you drinking? What's wrong? Are you pregnant? You know, those types of things. So, it's just a way that people are unwinding and de-stressing and communing with others. But I think really it's an escape from the immense amount of stress and pressure that we have on ourselves every single day, all the time.
So, Dr. Donohue, let's get into the specifics of this. How does alcohol increase the risk of, let's say, breast cancer specifically? And what is the biological mechanism behind alcohol toxicity to the cells?
Well, Armstrong, this is truly at risk of raining on the parade. I'm going to make the case very briefly that the right answer, honestly, the right answer regarding alcohol, even when the Ravens are playing your team, is abstinence. Here's principally how this happens. Alcohol is metabolized to a wickedly toxic product called acetaldehyde. And acetaldehyde is poison. There's simply no other way to describe it. And so it would be like asking, how much rust do you want in the water that you drink? Well, the obvious answer would be no rust. But the toxicity of the rust would go up as the content of the rust went up. So it is with alcohol. So all alcohol is metabolized to acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde does several important things. The first is that it damages DNA directly and beyond any reasonable dispute. It also decreases the absorption of important nutrients. It has hormone effects, which particularly likely relate to the increased risk of breast cancer amidst even moderate alcohol-consuming women. And so if you look at the different types of cancer, it's so important that we just remind our viewers that cancer is not a single disease. So it's only as a consequence of us not fully understanding it that we talk about it in this kind of blanketed way. But if you run down the list of malignancies that are clearly related, you begin, not surprisingly, with oral cancer and posterior oropharyngeal cancer, laryngeal cancer, esophageal cancer, gastric cancer, colorectal cancer, liver cancer, breast cancer. And so these are all things that somewhere between 1.4 and 5-fold increases of those things can be expected by drinking alcohol. And it also appears, Armstrong, that it's a dose-related effect. So if you smoked one Winston in your life, probably not much risk of developing adenocarcinoma of the lung. But if you smoke a half a pack a day for 30 years and so forth, likewise with alcohol. So the more you drink, the greater your risk. There's more to say about it, though. Sarah was just talking about stress. And it turns out that alcohol has some very interesting effects that continue beyond the period of lacking sobriety. So 3 to 4 days later, cortisol levels are measurably increased. Cortisol, as you know, is the so-called stress hormone. So cortisol being increased creates the feeling of being a little itchy twitchy. Sarah was describing how everybody's stressed. Now you're more stressed. So what happens, of course, is another handshake with the devil. So you try to relieve that stress by taking more alcohol. So we really, the right answer here is that we assert our own agency. We're not weak. We're not cowards. We're not overwhelmed by stress. We're masters of our experience. And that means that we do avoid things that are obvious traps. So if you don't drink, don't start. And if you do drink, have another look at this. Is it possible to watch the Ravens game this weekend, maintaining sobriety? And my last thought on this is, remember what Peter said in the opening sentence of one of his letters, which is, be serious and be sober. And I would argue, Armstrong, that with alcohol, you're neither.
You know, I want you to, because I see you shaking your head, Sarah. I want you, because I know you have more that you want to add. So please go ahead.
I think that this has been an amazing conversation. Like, thank you for bringing this to light, because it is a hard conversation to have, because as you said, nobody wants to hear it, right? And as someone who I help women going through perimenopause and menopause balance their hormones. Stress and that elevated cortisol is such a huge thing. So just as Dr. Donohue said, a couple of days after you drink alcohol, your stress level is even more elevated. You're feeling more anxious. You're feeling more irritable, and then you want to go back and resolve it with alcohol. But it's a toxin, right? So it is something that your body will cease other activities in order to rid itself of this toxin. And it will halt the fat burning process if you're trying to lose weight for up to 48, 72 hours sometimes. And it's not that it's taking that long for your body to metabolize, but it takes that long for your body to recalibrate. So if you're just having one drink a day, right, there's some statistics you should be aware of. One alcoholic drink a day increases a woman's risk of breast cancer by 7%, and it increases with higher consumption. Colorectal cancer is increased 2 to 3 drinks a day, increased by 21%, right? And then if you're looking at oral, esophageal, throat cancers, if you have 3 drinks a day, more than 3 drinks a day, it can increase the risk of those cancers by up to 500%, just because of the tissue's direct exposure to the acetaldehyde, right? So just the byproduct of alcohol. So, I mean, if you're eating bacon every day, you're having 3 beers a day, like your cancer risk is elevated. So I think just knowing that these statistics are out there can allow you to make educated decisions. And sometimes it's very difficult for people to completely abstain. But if they say, okay, twice a month I'm going to have alcohol, and I'm not going to feel badly about it, because the rest of the time I'm going to hydrate with water, right? I'm going to eat foods that are closest to their form in the ground, right? Beans, rice, plant-based things, fish. And I'm going to get out and move, and I'm going to do stress management techniques, right? Deep breathing techniques, mindfulness, prayer, meditation. And it has to be a way of life and a lifestyle that is something that works for you, right? But just as Dr. Donohue said, I mean, avoiding these things are obviously going to help you in the long run.
Dr. Donohue, before we go to break, how does this alcohol impact your liver functioning, which can lead to liver cancer?
Well, the first target of alcohol, alas, is the liver. And there's new literature we've all heard about the so-called gut-brain axis. People who think about these issues, Armstrong, all day and all night, are now talking about the gut-liver-brain axis. So these are little whispered conversations that take place with hormonal fluxes. But not surprisingly, alcohol is metabolized to acetaldehyde. Where would that be? In the liver. So, and there's not one good thing that can be said about acetaldehyde. So the occurrence of liver cancer down the road, people have heard of cirrhosis. Cirrhosis comes from the old root word scar. How do you get scarred? You get injured. And so sometimes the response to injury continues, and that's what oftentimes can lead alas, to malignancy. The other thing that we haven't touched on very briefly is the gut microbiome. So there's very interesting
hold that about the gut. Hold that for me, Dr. Donohue. We're going to take a break and come back with Dr. Donohue and Sarah. Don't go away.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
We continue with Dr. Donohue as he was getting into the gut.
So Armstrong, all of our viewers, I think, are aware of the gut microbiome. Think of it as the non-human inhabitants that we live happily with. And the fact that these are bacteria and viruses and fungi does not make them our enemy, au contraire. So homeostasis exists when the gut microbiome are at ease and not provoking immune response. Remember when you were a boy down in South Carolina and you cut your hand? If your mother didn't have any hydrogen peroxide, watch out, because she reached for the alcohol, and you gritted your teeth as she poured the alcohol on, because alcohol kills bacteria. We're not in the business, in terms of promoting health, of killing the bacteria that live with us happily in our gut microbiome. So alcohol has a direct sidal effect. That means it directly kills bacteria that we wish no harm to. And it metabolites, likewise, our sidal. That means they kill these bacteria. So that creates open spaces where other bacteria and like-minded organisms will populate. That creates what's thought to be the immune response to alcohol, which is now being seriously looked at. All of our viewers are aware of the negative effects of inflammation. Inflammation was described 1,500 years before the birth of Jesus by the Latins. They described calor, dolor, rubor. That means heat, red, pain. And not much has changed since those ancient days. So we don't want inflammation. When our good bacteria are assaulted or mutated or outright killed, other bacteria take their place in the swamp, and those bacteria are not our friends. They create a wicked immune response, and this is just now being looked at. So there is some thought that, now I'm not advocating drinking alcohol, but there is some very good thought, though no prospective randomized trials, that if you do take alcohol, think it through in advance. Don't have it be like the beef jerky that you bought in the 7-Eleven on an impulse. And take some products before you drink to support gut. So that includes uncultured yogurt. There are even some products now out on the market.
Sarah, what I find interesting is that physicians have all this knowledge, and they're some of the biggest consumers of alcohol to release stress. And if physicians who deal with the stats and know the facts every day, if they can't abide by their own findings, what makes you think that everyday people are going to do the same? But I just had another thought here. You think about alcohol, think about drugs, processed food, getting no sleep, no exercise, then you realize why you have such a sick society. You realize why the hospitals runneth over, because these things are pushed on us through advertising. Sometimes it's passed through us through hereditary, through our own DNA. And, you're just not going to break the cycle of something, because, look, I drink because my father drank, because his father drank. I smoke because I grew up in tobacco. So I grew up eating fatback and pig and all this pork stuff. And so breaking these habits, you have to go back generations. So in your sphere of experience, what is the best way to moderate, to minimize it? Because listen, people make a fortune off you taking their products, which eventually makes you sick. It's why our immune system is so weak. So many people contract COVID, people have heart attacks, they're having strokes, people are sick. And realize, you don't realize it overnight. It takes time before it comes full circle. And then we end up in the emergency room, in the dead room. Sarah?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that you can do is to just create awareness around your own habits, around your own family history, like what cancers run in your family, and really take inventory and then make educated decisions, because it's one thing if you're doing things that are going to worsen your health and you don't know that. Like, you're doing things because your parents did it, your grandparents or your great-grandparents did it, right? And you don't know any better. But I think once we have that awareness, it's just being honest with themselves, like, hey, listen, I had a terrible week. I know alcohol's not great for me, but I'm going out Friday night, I'm gonna have 5 drinks and I'm gonna sleep it off on Saturday. I'm probably gonna feel terrible for a couple of days, but it is what it is, right? And next week, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna get right back on it and I'm gonna start again. And give yourself a little bit of grace when you don't, quote unquote, live perfectly, right? But I think there's different answers for everybody, right? Everybody has their own shoes that they're walking in, and it's not for us as healthcare providers or coaches or fitness instructors, it's not for us to just say, well, stop drinking, right? Eat better, exercise more. That's not helpful information. I think it's really like, hey, let's take inventory. Like, there are basic things that will make you feel better, right? Make you think more clearly, help you to sleep more soundly, decrease inflammation in your body so that you can run around with your grandkids and have energy to do the things that you want to do, so that you feel well in general. But everybody's journey is a little bit different. And I think just being able to be self-aware, take inventory of what's happening in your body, and then just have those educated discussions with people who are going to help support you through that.
Dr. Donohue, I don't think anybody, no matter how much you see it, how much you sit by the bedside, I don't think anybody realizes what it means to really be sick and what people go through when they have these strokes and heart attacks and they have to go through rehabilitation. And what I find fascinating that what really brings about change with people that I've known over the years, when they actually go through that process, man.
Right.
Because they'll tell you, you have no idea. They say, I've gone to purgatory and back. And so I wouldn't wish that upon nobody. And sometimes what happens, it just takes someone dying and you almost dying and you being in the hospital and you go through that experience to bring about the change. And still, others can't live your experience. They can only live their own.
Yeah, you'll remember, Armstrong, that Portia in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice looked out a window and he said, the sweetness of adversity. So I've had just a little bit of a different experience over these 40 years of taking care of very ill patients. And that is this, that nothing succeeds like success. We're not in the finger-wagging business. We're not in the accusing business. But these practical steps are within everybody's wheelhouse. And when, because of a good and solid relationship with a healthcare provider, when we advocate these things, people feel better. That's true of people who have recently had acute myocardial infarction, aborted sudden cardiac death, vascular disease across the board. But it's also true of people who come to the doctor. They came for a reason. And so my own sense is that we shouldn't retreat from the moment. So it doesn't mean that we have our arms akimbo like the irate third grade school teacher wagging her finger at the errant child. But it does mean that we say things that we know to be true. We say them kindly but firmly. And so you can watch the game this weekend without alcohol. Your grandfather made his choices, but they're not your choices. So how is it we've become so weak and just kind of the inheritors of all these behavior patterns. We make our own choices, and both our present and our future are nothing other than the accumulated impact of the choices that we make today. So making different choices today is a way of embracing your future self. And as healthcare providers, I think we should avoid retreating from our own opportunity here to really be courageous servants of our patients.
You know, Sarah, it's really a delight meeting you and having your voice today. But we should also mention there's some people that get it right. You see patients and people mentally, physically, they are determined and they get it right. I mean, as we have this conversation, which sometimes just seems to make you contemplate if I could do this different, but there are people who they do it right. They live a long time, they enjoy life, and they find substitutes instead of these things that can bring about a quick death or slow death. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think really it comes down to, choose your hard, right? It's hard to be sick. It's hard to be overweight. It's hard to suffer with chronic diseases and go through cancer. It's also hard to get up and move more. It's also hard to abstain from alcohol. It's hard to go to bed at 10 o'clock at night and wake up at 6 o'clock every morning when everyone else is out partying till 2 and 3, right? But I think exactly what Dr. Donohue said, like just taking accountability for our own actions. And our bodies don't know any other way to communicate with us other than by symptoms. And sometimes they can be vague symptoms and sometimes it can be severe pain. So I think as a person who is independently thinking and making your own decisions, if you are starting to notice vague symptoms in your body, maybe start investigating, are there certain patterns? Are there things that I'm that maybe I could change? And then start taking actions. Because if you want different results, right, you have to take different actions and you have to take accountability for your decisions as well.
You know, Dr. Donohue and Sarah Gibson, I can't thank you. What a refreshing joy not to talk about politics today, that there are other things going on in the world that we can talk about that has to do with you, that's in your hands and not in the hands of somebody else. Because you are your healthcare provider. That's what you are. You've got to make these decisions. No one can make them for you. This is what free will is all about. You can either accept this conversation and make a change and reject it and continue with the habits and the ways that you have. You understand the consequences. No longer can you use ignorance and not knowing as an excuse. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Armstrong Williams.